Hey everyone! Welcome to another Screenwriting Tips. My name is Tony D, and my little dog Joan is roaming around. She might jump in later. Anyhow, today we're going to talk about comics to movies, the difference between doing a comic script versus a screenplay, and converting the comic into a screenplay. So, as you may or may not know, I don't just do screenplays, I also do comic books. I work for Bongo Comics as a freelancer, writing The Simpsons, Bart Simpson, a few of the other titles. I've also done work at Image and a few other places, Kenzer and Company, if you're familiar with that. So I had started as a screenwriter and then started doing comic scripts. And the biggest difference between the two is that screenplays are dialogue driven, right? You write the description of the scene and the characters. You don't really have to go too deep into the character look. Usually you just kind of give them a general description once, and then unless there's a major change, you just move forward. And it's all dialogue. Dialogue, maybe some action, but mainly dialogue drives almost everything in a screenplay. In comic books, you don't really have that luxury. You got to describe a lot more because the artist has to draw every panel. And it sort of depends on who you're working for. If you're working on as a work for hire at one of the comic book companies, how much you have to describe. Now, there's the Marvel way, which is more you plot things out, the artist draws it, and then you go back and add the dialogue. I always felt that was like a crazy way to do comics. It sort of puts most of the control on the artist, and I've worked with artists and they're great people, but they can get kind of just like anybody else. They can get flaky, they can get bored, and when artists are bored, they will draw all kinds of crazy things in the background, or you know, they may just, oh, I have a great idea for design and just throw it in. I had an artist I worked with, God, it was over 20 years ago. I described the character and he completely ignored me and said, oh, I came up with this design, and drew like 3 pages, and I was just like flabbergasted that he would completely ignore my notes. You know, so imagine you're scripting Spider-Man and a guy just draws some rando superhero you've never seen before because he thinks that's better. That happens. I mean, it happens. It's not a major issue, but it's something you have to contend with. So in the world of comics, you have to describe every panel. You know, you don't have to go into detail for every single character per se. I mean, obviously Spider-Man, a character like Spider-Man has a look. Bart Simpson has a look. And those are pretty static. You know, you don't have to go too deep, but you do have to describe any new character and what they look like. You have to describe what the scene looks like. A lot of times you may even have to describe the angle. So it's a lot more work in terms of the description. Maybe not quite as much as a novel, where you're not only writing description, but you're kind of trying to write it in a way that's easier to read. It's more functional than that. It's functional like a screenplay, but it's closer to maybe writing a scene description almost every panel. Not quite, but you know, almost. And whereas in a screenplay, an action scene might take up this much space and a really long one might take a page. In the world of comics, it's going to take a lot of panels and maybe several pages to do an action sequence. I know that sounds weird, but the dialogue's actually a lot tighter in a comic book because, you know, if it's just short, punchy dialogue, it takes up very little space, whereas the description, there's way more description in a comic script, so there's going to be a lot more. And you have to be very wary of your dialogue in a comic. You can't put too much. If you have a big monologue with your character, you know, a big monologue in comics is like, you know, 2 paragraphs. That's like huge. That's like really huge. You know, 5 or 6 sentences, yeah, that's a big chunk of dialogue for a comic reader to read. Usually It's one sentence and maybe two. That's generally the dialogue in a comic. Even shorter than that is ideal. 4 or 5 words per character. And sometimes in comics there are little tropes you use, like characters finishing each other's sentences, that kind of thing, when they're putting stuff together to get everybody to talk. Or, because if you just have, say like a Sherlock Holmes guy explain everything, it'll just be him in the panel and a big giant balloon of dialogue. And people tend to see giant balloons of dialogue and go, ugh, that's a lot to read. I don't know why that is, because really, if you compare it to a novel or anything else, it's not that much to read, but it feels like more when comics are normally so short and punchy. Isn't that weird? So, going from screenplays to comics feels like you're really stomping on the brakes in terms of getting used to that format. It's a lot slower format. You can only describe so much. You can only jam so much in a 22-page comic, and it feels like, oh man, I have so much more to say and do, and I can only put a little bit. But you have to kind of focus on, in comics, the smaller elements. Very tiny expressions, very little status changes, just one big status change, and that's about it. That's all you need. And that's big in a comic, because when you have fewer things, the fewer things you have come out better. If you jam too much in a comic, it gets way too busy too fast. Now, if you're taking a comic book and you're converting it into a movie, you're kind of going the other way. The first thing you have to do is you really have to identify a movie plot. A comic book plot tends to be, if it's a long-running serial, tends to be closer to a television show than it is to a movie. Now, there are exceptions. So, for instance, when Batman, the famous Batman big crossover, I don't know what you'd call it, not really a crossover, but the big story Nightfall back in the 90s, where Batman finally gets beaten by Bane, and so that is a movie type plot. I mean, you would have to cut a lot of stuff out because it was several issues, but that had a big climax and a conclusion that everybody was waiting for. Same with the death of Superman and those sort of big stories, the crossover stories, Crisis on Infinite Earths, if you remember that back from the 80s. They've done it like a million times. The Secret Wars, Infinity War, which is playing in theaters now. You can take that. Now, obviously, Infinity War had other elements that they had to streamline for the movie, but it's a good structure because it's a big story and because it involves all these characters. They took quite a bit from the comics. Now, some of it went by the wayside, but some of it's definitely going to go by the wayside. When you literally have dozens of characters running around your superhero universe, you can't have them all in. The Fantastic Four, they're gone. Their movies didn't work, so they tried and tried and tried. And the Fantastic Four is an interesting example because really, the Fantastic Four movie, the one big movie plot was Galactus. And that kind of only worked partly because the Fantastic Four was so big in the world of Marvel Comics. So it worked within the confines of the Marvel Universe in the comic. But as a movie, unfortunately, it kind of didn't work. Part of the reason, I think, is the Fantastic Four is a little dated in terms of its origin, because it was created during that time period of space exploration when the moon landing was pretty new, and everybody was crazy about astronauts, that kind of thing, because they were kind of like astronauts who got superpowers, and that was very exciting for the era. Now, it doesn't read as well. You don't have every kid in America wanting to be an astronaut now. Unfortunately, the Fantastic Four hasn't found its groove in movies, despite several attempts. I could probably pitch a couple of ways to fix it, but at this point they've tried it too many times, and in Hollywood, when you try a bunch bunch of times and fail, you kind of get the stink of death on you, and nobody wants to touch that. Everybody wants to forget about that. Even some of the actors who were in those movies, you know, their careers suffered because of it, because nobody, of course, wants to take the blame. So, you know, even though the actors typically have the least amount of control on a giant movie like that, I mean, they're just, you know, they're lucky if they get any input, really. I mean, they get input on the acting, of course, but, you know, in terms of the script and the marketing and all that kind of stuff, they don't have any control over that. So if a movie does badly because they release it at the wrong time, or people get the wrong impression from the trailers, you know, there's nothing much they can do about that. So, what should you look out for in scripting from comics to movies? Again, bigness. You have to have a big story. You have to pick... Now, it's not just superhero movies. There are other comics, too. You got The Crow, which is kind of a superhero movie. You got Road to Perdition. Oh, gosh. There's been, like, so many of them. You can look them up. There's just tons of comics out there that some of them are scripted like a movie. I mean, Road to Perdition is scripted more like a movie than it is an ongoing comic. A movie like Judge Dredd, that was scripted more like a classic comic. And the first time they tried it, really, they tried to jam in the big story, but the problem with that big story was that was revealed over many comics, and they were kind of jamming in 100 issues of Judge Dredd into one movie, and it kind of didn't work. There were some other problems too. I've talked about the Dredd movie a little bit. You know, it just didn't work. Now the second Dredd movie with Carl Urban, that worked, and that was more like a regular issue of Dredd. You know, that could have been done in one issue of Dredd. Him going into a hotel, going after a gangster. That was very typical of Judge Dredd. But you could push it up a little bit, raise the stakes, and I guess that's what you really need to do. You need to raise the stakes a little bit, make it a little bit personal. You can't really get too personal with Judge Dredd. That's not the kind of character it is. But you definitely get out there and you make it more like a movie. You find enough elements to fill the 3-act structure. So really, you have the 3-act structure, and you're just taking the pieces of the comic and inserting them in where they're appropriate. And everything else you have to leave behind and save that, you know, hopefully if there's another movie or if there's a TV show spinoff and that kind of thing. I mean, you can keep it open enough. Like the Carl Urban Judge Dredd, it was open enough that, you know, they didn't include every single element from the comic. They just included enough to make the movie work. And that's what you want. You want just enough of the elements to make it solid for the comic fans and make it workable as a movie. So that's basically it. It's really like a formatting issue. But just keep in mind that most comics tend to lean towards, especially the serial ones, tend to lead towards television in terms of their formatting. And that your job is to sort of transfer that from my dog's running around, from a television type plot to a more of a movie plot. I don't know if you can hear her running. Come on, doggy, you want to say hi to the audience? Yeah. So keep that in mind when you're converting comics to movies. If you're converting movies to comics, again, go the other way. You're going to explore the world a little more. When I was doing The Simpsons, what I would try to do is focus on the characters who were popular but hadn't gotten a lot of play. So you knew them enough to recognize them, but maybe their world wasn't big on the show and you could explore it a little more. So I always liked Disco Stew. So I did a bunch of Disco Stew stories until I kind of ran out of gas on that, and then I moved on to other stuff. But that's what you do. You kind of go the other way. You do smaller. So comics to movies big, movies to comics small. And that's screenwriting tips for today. I gotta go. I got a million things to do. Thanks for watching. Smash like, as PewDiePie says. And if you want to send me money, I'm on Patreon. I'm on BitChute. Check me out at the Webcomic Factory and Superfrat. See ya.